happens.
Live streaming is on.
Here we go. And yeah, just like that, apparently we're going to be live momentarily. Cool. Let me just post the links to Facebook so people can join us. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As you guys will be able to see, I am joined once again by my longtime co-host, the godfather of vampire thrillers, Brian McKinley.
Hello.
So you don't have to just listen to my voice for the next hour, which hopefully will be an improvement. Okay, here we go. And just feel free to entertain the audience while I post links.
Oh, I forgot my keys to dangle.
Shame on you, Brian. You have one job. You know this.
Yeah.
But welcome back. It's good to have you back again.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be back.
So it's hard carrying an entire show solo. Particularly when as you of course know, I am violently allergic to those little details like scripts and advanced planning. Okay, and that's posted, so we're good to go. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist in the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am joined by my friend and co-host,
Brian McKinley.
Okay. I'm confused. There we go. Okay, now people can see my pretty face. Or ugly mug as however they may see it. Let's see. There we go. So I can hopefully hear you a little better because you're a little quiet. But tonight we are going to be talking about the Third Reich, and more specifically about the occult's influences both within the Reich and on the Reich from the outside, particularly in its origins. In all the time we've done this show, I'm not sure we've covered a more touchy topic. Because anything related, I mean, if we were monetized, just saying the word Nazi, boom, demonetized.
Really?
Yeah. YouTube's very picky about that. And people have a lot of opinions about when you talk about the Nazis and the occult. And most of them, in my experience, are very passionate. People are either very, very convinced that there were all these occult forces influencing the Nazis. You know, the arguments about whether Hitler was possessed, for example.
Yeah, that's one that I came across.
And that's certainly something I'd like to get into. And then you have the people who are like, no, Hitler was a materialist. He didn't take any of this seriously. The Thule Society was kicked out of Germany. And the reality, in my opinion, having spent some time researching this subject, like in many things, is down the middle. What do you think?
I think you're right. I mean, a lot of the research, what I was able to see, seemed to be on the subject of debunking a lot of this connection between the occult and the Third Reich, saying that it wasn't as dramatic as it's been made out to be by certain fringe scientists and historians.
Which I generally agree with. I've been reading a really good book called Hitler's Monsters, The Supernatural History of the Occult. And he actually makes a very big point about calling it the supernatural, not the occult. Particularly because occult has very specific connotations of like secret societies and elite knowledge and things of that nature, which the Nazis were not big on. But they believed in a lot of what was called then, and even now in some circles, border science.
Yeah.
these ideas that most people would see as supernatural or occult today, like astrology, which we're certainly going to get into, or world ice theory.
Areology.
Yes, their entire ideas of race, for that matter. I mean, the whole reason, they thought, so at least some of them thought that the Aryans came from Atlantis.
Hmm.
But and some of them certainly Heinrich Himmler was into all sorts of crazy shit.
Yes, he was easily the most superstitious of the high-ranking Nazis.
Yeah, Speer was close behind him, though.
Spear, oh yeah,
Yeah.
the architect.
Yes. The guy who had the bright idea to fly to England to broker his own peace treaty without consulting anybody.
Oh, that was Hess.
Oh, Hess as well was actually into it.
Okay.
Yeah. Then, yeah.
Spear was the architect.
Yeah.
Hess was the one that flew the plane.
Yeah. He was big on the occult. In fact, there's a whole thing with Aleister Crowley also figures prominently into this entire arc at several interesting places.
Yeah, I've seen that claim as well. Although it's been pretty well, it's only mentioned like a couple of places or a couple of places, and none of them are documented or well sourced.
Well, on the other hand, he was a friend of Ian Fleming, and Fleming did try to involve him in the war on the British side, which has led to theories that Crowley may have actually been a British spy, which I think is unlikely. No one has enough of a background, it wouldn't completely shock me either.
No, but he's a little too high profile to make a good spy.
True. But I think the first thing that's probably worth talking about is the proverbial elephant in the room, which is the thing that most movies with the Nazi occult, at least today, most books talk about, which is the Thule Society. Mm-hmm. And a logical outgrowth of talking about Thule is the Aristophicists and the Anthropophicists and Theosophy itself.
And because the Anunnaki.
Yes, which also leads logically into the Anunnaki.
Yeah, the society that Himmler created.
Yes, because one thing I found really interesting in doing my research, Hitler was very interested in the occult and in magic and in folklore. Which isn't to say that he believed in any of it, but he saw it as a useful tool for propaganda.
Yes.
I mean, we found books. There's a book, Magic in Theory and Practice. It was published by a parapsychologist in Germany between the two world wars. We know for certain Hitler owned a copy of it, and it's very likely he underlined extensively a number of key phrases about Satan and Lucifer and things of that, and the nature of magic and how it relates to power. Mm-hmm. Which again, I'm certainly, he mostly seems to have been a materialist, although he believed in some dumb things we're going to get into. But he at least saw value in it as a tool. Because he knew that, it's just like the debate about Hitler's religious beliefs. There's a lot of evidence that he was not actually, despite what everybody assumes, Roman Catholic. But he certainly saw Catholicism and Christianity in a broader sense as ways to manipulate people. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, a lot of the people that were very close to Hitler and were close to Himmler and were close to other high-ranking Nazis were members of the Thule Society. Although neither Himmler nor Hitler themselves ever attended a meeting, as far as we know. Mm. But where this really does relate to Nazism is all of the ideas of racial purity, of the superiority of the Germans, of this master race of Aryans, start in 19th century occult ideas. Is this group Aristophany that split off from Theosophy that really starts to parrot a lot of the beliefs that Hitler himself would ultimately run his platform on. Oh, hey, Teresa Hall, Gulf City Pagan. Welcome aboard. Thanks for joining us. She wasn't around, I think, when you were last with us, but she's become a quite regular listener to the show.
Oh, okay, great.
But I agree that she said, "Dang it, I'm late. This topic is so interesting." It really is interesting, and the more you dig into it, the more complicated it gets. You can make a case for almost any major member of the party believing in astrology and magic, or not believing in it and just seeing it as a political tool, depending on how you read certain quotes, the relationship with certain people. I'll say one of the other things I find very interesting about the Thule Society is a lot of people dismiss the connection to the Thule because the Thule was outlawed by the Nazis during the war. And they were, at least in theory, kicked out of Germany.
Right.
For that matter, the Freemasons were supposed to have been kicked out of Germany and sent to concentration camps. And for that matter, astrology was banned at one point. The thing you realize is, officially these things were banned. In practice, a lot of very prominent people in these movements were still in close with the Nazi Party and remained so through a lot of the war, even after what they were doing was technically illegal.
Yeah, Himmler had a astrological chart drawn up for Hitler for a birthday present.
Well, that's the thing. That's the most consistent thing that people would see as a cult that a lot of the Nazis believed in is astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Himmler absolutely believed in it. Most of the high-ranking Nazis seem to have believed in it and taken it very seriously. At the same, and that's another one of those places where this gets interesting. Because, they did pass laws against astrology and still have actively practicing astrologers who they openly supported. Because there was this idea at the time of kind of the difference between the shyster mediums that you saw in the years after World War I and the parapsychologists who were actually legitimately trying to study these claims. And while the Nazis were very supportive of what they saw as a scientific approach to the occult, people that were scientifically trying to understand the influence of these cosmic forces upon your life, in the case of astrology, they also had this belief that there were other people that were just in it for the money and were ripping people off. So you could stay an astrologer in Nazi Germany and be successful and be popular with the high-ranking members of the Reich, as long as at least you can pay lip service to being scientific about it.
Mm-hmm. So it looked good.
I'm sorry?
I said that way, it looked good.
Yes, exactly. Like another one of the things and this is a form of the occult that Hitler actually did seem to believe in, dowsing.
Mm-hmm.
Because dowsing was, again, there's this idea of border sciences, the sciences that are on the fringe, the fringe of what's considered mainstream science, but to varying degrees, at least some of the practitioners were using at least semi-scientific methods to try to test the claim, or at least claim to have done so and have mathematics to back it up. The reality is a lot of it's as bullshit as the rest of it.
Mm.
But we know, for example, that Hitler hired dowsers to check his headquarters for the presence of negative cosmic rays that could sap the strength of Nazis. So, again, it's and that's actually another good one, I think, to go into. Did you find anything in your research about this world ice theory?
No, I didn't get into that. That was a little crazy even for me. But go ahead and explain what that is, because that's just...
It's insane.
Yeah.
So in the 19th century, a German philosopher had a vision. And he claimed in this vision to have realized that the gravitational pull of the star didn't reach past 3 times the distance to Jupiter. So since the sun only could reach that far, he figured we have to figure out what formed up these other stars and solar systems and things that are out there. And he developed this idea of world ice theory. Supposedly, there was a star in the sense that the rest of us would think of as a star, probably our own sun to be precise. And then there was another star, except this star was full of water. And the two collide with each other, and the water star explodes and spews water all over the place, and because space is cold, the water freezes. So you have these massive chunks of ice that make up some of the more distant planets in our solar system, that make up other solar systems. And not only that, the moon that we see in the sky now, and that we saw in the 1940s, isn't Earth's original moon. Because originally we were orbited by a giant ball of ice that was our moon.
Of course.
That hit the Earth, which caused the dinosaurs to die out. And there's been a series of these big moons of ice that have struck the Earth, caused various disasters like the sinking of Atlantis, Noah's flood, and it's completely ridiculous. There's no science whatsoever to back this up. It's as stupid as it sounds to the people who are listening to this. But Hitler took it very seriously. He said that this, not the Big Bang, was the true German cosmology of the universe. And if you want an idea of how much these silly ideas influenced real policy, well, the Aryan people had survived some of the more later ice impacts with Earth. So they had a superior physiology that gave them an advantage in the cold. It's not the only reason, but it is among the reasons why the Nazis thought that they were going to do just fine invading Russia in winter. And thought Russia was going to have a hard time because their inferior genes wouldn't stand up to the superior Aryan ones.
Mm-hmm. Saw how that worked out.
Exactly. It's like, I also wanted to say hi to Slicka, who's a new listener who's actually joined us. I haven't seen them in chat before. But, and that's at least to me, this is the fascinating thing, is you have all of these weird ideas. World ice theory isn't technically magic. It's just pseudoscientific bullshit. But it was taken very seriously.
Yeah, it's on the weak side of what you could call a theory, even.
It's a conspiracy. It's more like the conspiracy theory sense of a theory.
Yeah.
And it's the thing I want to say is people have this idea, especially true believers have this idea that these secret occult powers influenced the Nazis. And they really didn't. And that's not the thesis I'm proposing here. Isn't that magical power? Everything we're going to talk about, at least everything I plan on talking about, I'm betting everything you're planning about talking about, because I know you, works just as well under the assumption that we live in a materialistic universe where it's all bullshit. Because the question isn't, were there Nazi wizards that had real magic powers? The question is, did the Nazis think there were real Nazi wizards who had real magic power?
So far, I haven't found anything to say that they did.
Bullgut. That'd be the biggest example. The spiritual advisor to Heinrich Himmler, who designed a lot of the SS rituals. He was a weirdo. He actually, from what I've read, thought he was a descendant of the Norse god Thor.
Okay.
But it's like again, it's like if there's anywhere in the Nazi Party you're going to look and see outright belief in the bizarre and the magical, it's going to be among the SS.
Yeah,
and Himmler himself.
Highly ritualized society they had.
He actually very much saw it as quasi-occult order, very much similar to the Teutonic Knights.
Yes. So much that he had them swear a similar oath.
Yes, there's the other interesting thing I had heard that is in fact quite untrue. And although it's actually true, but it's not true in the way that people seem to think, is I've had people who tell me that'll talk about things like how the SS had, God with us on their belt buckles. They did not. They had this thing about honor and loyalty on the belt buckles. The guys who had the "Thank God with us" is the Wehrmacht, the normal army, and the armed forces. They are and the thing about that as well, and I think this is important because it goes to the religious side of all of this, is that God with us on the belt buckles wasn't something that started among the Nazis. It had been with the Germans since the 19th century. They were during World War I as well.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of forces had something similar.
Yeah. That's another one of the weird ones I've run into is you have this argument, and one of the common complaints I've heard, at least, when you talk about the Nazis' interest in particularly paganism and the Teutonic mythology, is no, the Nazis were Christians. And the answer is actually yes and no. Because, yes, even Himmler and a lot of the other Nazis worshipped a figure they called Christ, or more accurately, Christ. But they didn't see Christ as a Jewish carpenter who lived in Jerusalem. They saw him as a Germanic god, very similar to and alongside Balder. So they mixed Christian ideas with the occult. It's not were they occultists or were they Christians. It was yes. The evidence seems to be that they pretty much adopted liberally anything they liked.
The salad bar approach.
Exactly. And there's, again, Hitler himself, if you read his public speeches and things like that, or if you read Mein Kampf, he invokes God a lot. And he seems at least ostensibly to be Christian. But if you go to Hitler's table talks, if you go to conversations he had with Himmler, with, what's his name? Starts with a B. With Goering, with Goebbels, starts with a B. He was one of the Mormon. Yeah. He talks about seeing Christianity as a threat to the Third Reich and to Nazism. Not something. There seems to be a strong implication that he was content to let the church exist for now. He saw it as an enemy to deal with once the war was over and they had won. Because he didn't want to turn the people again. He knew it was too useful of a political tool. Right. The argument I've definitely seen, I think, makes sense, is that what he really ultimately wanted was much more what you found in Russia under Stalin, where the church had been replaced by the state, and that veneration and that respect and that worship and that sense of community you get from the church was directed to the state and this ideal of what you wanted things to be, rather than a man-made institution. Right. Which is also it also goes back to why Hitler outlawed the Freemasons and he outlawed the Thule Society. He didn't want any group threatening his power. He didn't want any society, any secret societies or groups that drew people's loyalty away from him. Yeah. He was against that. Whereas other groups that were very, the Thule Society and Aristocracy existed for so long when other groups like them were being thrown out of Germany, precisely because, for the most part, they saw Hitler as this heroic, messianic figure. And he was okay with, when you're telling everybody, follow me, I am the savior, you're kind of okay with that when you're a megalomaniac the way he was.
Yeah.
So how about you, Brian? What are some of the interesting things you found in your research?
Mostly the like I said, the Anerby, the secret
Yes.
society, the think tank that Himmler put together in 1935.
They're really interesting. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about that?
Just that they were the basis for what you see in like Raiders of the Lost Ark and whatnot, where they were the ones that were funding uh, archaeological digs and expeditions and things of that nature. They went all around the world looking for, occult items and things to back up this Aryan history of the world that Hitler was proposing.
You're absolutely right. I mean, even some of the stuff you see in the Indiana Jones movies is accurate. They really did go looking for the Holy Grail.
Mm-hmm.
Himmler particularly was very interested in the Grail. He didn't think, again, with this weird mixing of different traditions, he didn't see it as a symbol, a Christian symbol. He thought it was something from the Norse, the Germanic and Norse mythology attached to Odin.
Mm-hmm.
But what's funny is that Himmler would ultimately hire this guy by the name of Otto Rahn to go looking for the Grail. And ultimately Rahn would join the SS. There's some evidence, it's not confirmed, but Rahn wasn't German, was at least probably partly Jewish, and might have been a homosexual. So
it was about the first time that they were critical like that.
Which is, I think, another really big point here that's worth reinforcing is the Nazis were gigantic hypocrites.
Yeah.
I mean, anytime you research anything about their ideologies, it's like there were Jews that were accepted by the Nazis. There was a Jewish doctor that Hitler personally had escorted out of Germany to safety because he had helped treat his mother. And all of these other weird ideas, it's like they weren't even consistent in being evil. Not to mention they're very anti-homosexual, but there's apparently at least some evidence a number of members in the higher-ranking members may have had homosexual tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, just goes back to that whole thing about homophobes and what it actually says about you.
Yeah. Usually, the stronger it is, there's some kind of a reason behind it.
Yeah, and often it's self-hate. The other one, the therapy are interesting in a lot of ways. The other one I find interesting, particularly because this relates to the interest in magic, is that one of the very first expeditions that they organized, let's see, let me double check because I want to get the right place. Yeah, was to Karelia, which is a part of Finland, where they went looking for pagan sorcerers and witches. And then, whether they believed it, when they went into it believing it or not, they went looking for magic. They sent people to Italy. They sent people to various parts of Germany and France. For that matter, most famously, there's the 1939 expedition to Tibet.
Yes.
Which leads to another interesting question with the religious thing, is that a lot of the high-ranking Nazis were very interested in Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yeah,
Case in point,
strange.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just saying it was strange for them.
It was, although it loops back in on itself again, because they were interested in Hinduism, they're interested in Buddhism. In fact, the swastika is not uniquely a Hindu-Buddhist symbol, it is predominantly used in Hinduism and Buddhism.
Right, that's where they stole that from.
Sort of. That's the other interesting thing is, it was mostly being used there at the time, as a symbol of both life and death, depending on the orientation. Although both are signs of good luck. Because the Hindu idea about cycles and reincarnation, death is a beginning, not just yeah, exactly. Basically, it represents that wheel. But it's much older. It's older than even Hinduism, which is one of the oldest religions still practiced in the world. Case in point, they have founded a Neolithic human, pottery and things like that, found in Germany, which fits nicely into why the Germans liked the Hindus and the Buddhists, because they thought the Hindus and the Buddhists were Aryans.
Didn't know that.
Yes, which also actually cycles back into the occult connections, because when you look at the views of Theosophy and Aristophacy, they thought, they had this idea of these secret masters who controlled a lot of the world, who were the superior race that came from India and Tibet. For that matter, Hitler also thought the Japanese were pretty close to being. That was one of the funniest things I came across very recently in my research today. Is in some senses it seems like the Nazis might have been among the first. What's the word I'm looking for? Weeaboos. Because there's a definite fondness and fascination there for Japanese culture, and particularly for the samurai and the Bushido code. And since they had this idea, what?
I can see where that would hold some appeal for them.
Yes, they again with this idea that the Japanese were kind of honorary Aryans.
Mm-hmm.
Bushido is connected to the German ideas of honor and courage, and this Aryan ideal that the Nazis were trying to spread. Which, of course, was also the whole thing with the Anunnakis. As you're saying, the whole point was to prove their ridiculous theories about race and this Aryan race that's supposedly the master race that existed throughout the world. Hitler argued there's basically three types of race, in his opinion. There are the races that create art. There are the cultures that appreciate art. And then there's the worst of the three, the cultures that destroy culture and art. The Aryans, of course, are the creators of art, which is another way that they're superior. And the Jews don't make according to Hitler, they don't make their own art. They destroy art. They're destroyers and ruiners.
Mm-hmm.
Which is the other thing I have to say I know lots of other people like myself find this topic interesting, and it is fascinating, but it's so stupid. It's like reading what Hitler believed about race, reading what the others believed about race, reading the origins of those ideas. It's like, how can anyone take this seriously?
Yeah.
And that's the really depressing part, is people still do.
Yeah. Yeah, this stuff still gets recycled and brought out.
And it's the other thing that's been interesting. You see a lot among people that study Nazi occultism is whatever you feel about the occult aspects of the original Nazi party, with the rise of neo-Nazism and white supremacy, there's a definite connection to the occult and to Germanic neo-paganism, which infuriates the neo-pagans.
Yeah.
Because there's Odinism, which is the worship of Odin and the Norse gods. And a lot of it, from what I understand, is actually pretty authentic to the records we have of traditional Germanic Norse paganism.
Yeah.
The difference is they throw in this huge heaping of white supremacy and racism that just isn't there in the prose and the Eddas.
Yeah, it just becomes a cheap excuse.
Which reminds me of something else I wanted to talk. Well, in a roundabout way, reminds me of something else I wanted to bring up, because this is probably the most famous conspiracy theory on the topic, which is the Spear of Destiny.
Oh, yeah.
So, for the one person in the audience who might not know what I mean by the Spear of Destiny, when Jesus Christ was crucified in the Bible, they run into a situation because it's Friday night. It's Friday. Night's starting to fall, and Jesus is crucified with two thieves. They're not well. Jesus had died. The Bible says he gave up the ghost, and viewers thought he was dead. The thieves weren't dead, and in Jewish custom, of course, Sabbath, the holy day, starts at sunset on Friday, and ends on Saturday, which means that if something isn't done, those three bodies are going to hang on those crosses 2 days before anybody can come take them down and bury and do anything with them. So they asked that the Romans intervene, and what the Romans do is they break the legs of the two thieves, which was actually fairly common during crucifixion. People used to say it wasn't. We've since found bodies of crucified victims where the legs were broken, which would basically force the weight of the body forward, but the body would be held back by the nails through the wrists or hands. There's debate about that. And eventually the person would slowly suffocate as their chest was crushed by the weight of their own body. But they couldn't do that with Jesus, but at least the Bible says they can't do that with Jesus, because there's a prophecy that he will be pierced through the side, but no bone will be broken. So, Roman centurion, traditionally known as Longinus, who supposedly later converted to Christianity, and in Eastern Orthodoxy is known as Saint Longinus, comes forward and he takes a spear and he pierces Christ's side. And when they remove the spear, blood and water come out of the wound. This is a real thing, because what basically would have happened is if the spear had pierced the heart sac, which is quite reasonable given where it hits the side of the body, water would have come out of the wound as well as blood. So there's nothing supernatural about the blood, about the water coming out. But it also means that if that happened as described, he's dead. Because he had a large piece of metal shoved into his heart instead. Which was the point of doing this? It was to verify that he was dead so that he could be taken down and his body prepared for burial. Folklore and legend, going back over 1,000 years, grants special power to the spear that pierced the side of Christ. And it's known as the Spear of Destiny. The earliest references I know to it having special powers are in the early Grail epics of Arthurian legend, probably Parzival. Because supposedly the Fisher King, the king that presides over the special castle that holds the Grail, was injured when he was stabbed with the same spear. And he has to eat... basically, according to the story of Parzival, every day a dove comes down, puts a communion wafer on the Grail, and the Fisher King eats that, and it keeps him alive for another day. But there are supposedly, technically 5 objects in the modern world that are supposed to be that may be the Spear of Destiny. One of them is Joyous, the sword of Charlemagne, which in some of the legends about Charlemagne, the Spear of Destiny was melted down to make the sword. One is in St. Peter's Basilica, underneath the basilica. Good luck getting it out. Not to mention, to get it out, you'd have to invade the Vatican. Good luck. I forget where the other 2 are, and it's not significant enough to this discussion for me to look them up. But one of them was in a national museum in Austria. We know, as a matter of history, that the Nazis seized the collection in that museum and seized this spear that at the time was often thought to have been the spear, the Holy Spear, the spear that pierced the side of Christ. A writer by the name of Trevor Ravenscroft has claimed that was the Spear of Destiny. Hitler was obsessed with it and thought it gave him occult power and the divine right to rule. And the story even goes a step further to say that when the Allied forces finally recaptured the spear is literally the day that Hitler committed suicide. Everything I just said is horse manure.
Mm.
And let me break down why. First of all, in, I want to say 2005, they did metallurgy tests on the spear in the Austrian Museum. And it's somewhere around 500 years after the time of Christ. There's no possible way it was the spear in question. What's interesting, though, is that the legend is that there's a nail that's worked into the spear, that it's one of the three nails that held Christ to the cross. That was obviously added after the piercing. The metallurgy tests on the nails, I understand it, suggested that it might actually be older than the spear itself. So that may actually, I'm not saying it is. Who the heck, at this point, even if we could date it to the right time period, who the heck would know? But it could hypothetically have been one of the crucifixion nails. But no testing has come anywhere near being conclusive on that. All we know for sure is it can't be the spear. It's hundreds of years too late. The other big problem with this is they found the spear about 6 months after Hitler committed suicide.
Yeah.
So it's like, no. I'm sorry. As cool a story as it is that they found this magical spear and he committed suicide, just mystically knowing his chances were over. No, it's 6 months later. Now, supposedly Ravenscroft did all this research. So you might ask yourself, how could he have gotten something so obvious wrong as 6 months between the two events? And the answer is quite simple. The research Ravenscroft did involved talking to a spirit medium. Even one of the people that he swore up and down he had talked to and befriended and taken notes from, the widow of the guy was like, he never met my husband. And then he later had to turn around and admit, yeah, that was also through a spirit medium. But it's this huge idea that people take very seriously.
Which is ridiculous because you couldn't credit a spirit medium on a high school paper as a source.
I agree. There's certainly a more logical argument I've heard that I think may hold some weight, because we know that Hitler certainly grew up in Austria. There's some evidence he would have spent some time around that museum. It's possible that he did in fact want to claim the spear for political reasons. Because certainly, given even by then the legends about the spear, it seems logical that he'd see it as a useful tool for propaganda.
Oh yeah, it certainly didn't hurt.
But he was far too materialistic, I think, to put that much emphasis on a spear.
Yeah. No, he believed too much in himself, not that some outside object was going to give him magic powers.
Yeah. I think he probably would have been insulted by the idea. It's like, how dare you? I am the chosen savior of Germany.
Exactly.
Which I think is another thing worth considering is from everything, and I did a whole video for anyone who's interested on my thoughts about Hitler's religion. So I'm not going to go into it here, but in great detail here, I should say. But in my personal opinion, take of it what you will, I think deep down Hitler thought he was a messianic figure. Not like the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, more like the character of Siegfried from Wagnerian operas and Germanic folklore. But he saw himself as this divinely appointed hero who had come to raise up the Aryan people and save them from their enemies.
Yeah.
It's also one of the good arguments I've heard made, because although this is also something worth getting into, but it's one of the good arguments I've heard made for why the Nazis hated the Jews so much, is if you consider yourself the master race, and you have this other group that claims to be the chosen people of God, you're going to obviously see the chosen people of God as a natural threat to your claim of being the superior race. The irony of which is, if you get into Jewish theology on the subject, it doesn't make them automatically superior to everybody else per se. Case in point, and I was just posting about this on something else on Facebook. In Judaism, there are 613 laws that you are supposed to follow if you're a Jew. Not 10, 613. If you're a Gentile, there are 7. That's the difference. Is to be a Jew, you have all these other rules you have to follow, nobody else does. There's a covenant that was made with God that gives you certain advantages if you follow all of those rules. But it's still more responsibility than, here, have a bunch of bonuses just because you were born Jewish.
Yeah. Well, plus the Jews made an easy political scapegoat at the time. It was fashionable to hate them.
Which is the other thing I think that's worth mentioning here, is it's very easy to pick on the Nazis for believing stupid things. Because they did. But they weren't the only ones. I mean, belief in and interest in the occult was common all over Europe in the 30s. And the United States, for that matter.
Yeah.
There was a revival of interest in Eastern mysticism. Astrology was very popular. Dowsing was very popular. The Nazis were not unique in these interests. They seem to have taken it further, and it may have had more influence on their ideas than anyone else. Because we can go deeper and deeper. Very famously, what's his name? Scorzeni, the man who famously led the commando raid to rescue Benito Mussolini after he had been captured. Where they hang-lighted in this very dramatic raid. There are at least claims that have been made that, truth of them, who knows, probably from a very practical, cynical sense, there's probably a lot of propaganda behind it, that astrologers and dowsers helped find where they were keeping Mussolini and helped guide the raid. Which actually makes me think of a whole other topic we haven't touched in yet. The other way that there's one other way that Nazis absolutely used occult thinking and belief in astrology, which is a way it's used today by the U.S. and not many other governments today. Psychological warfare.
Yes.
Case in point, there's a period of time where Great Britain and Nazi Germany peppered the other side with astrological predictions of who was going to win the war.
Yeah, I remember that with Nostradamus. It was a lot.
Yeah, the Germans altering Nostradamus quatrains to make it sound like they were going to win. And it's quite interesting, particularly because while there's a lot of debate to be had on the German side, just given how many people in high command do seem to have had some belief in astrology, for the most part, the British didn't believe in any of this nonsense. Again, they just saw it as a useful tool of propaganda. Which leads to another excellent point that I want to get into before we get into the werewolves versus vampire revelation that I made.
Oh, boy. Still not sure about that one.
I know what you mean, but one other, because as I said, Aleister Crowley does factor into this story in a really weird way. So Ian Fleming, the man who wrote James Bond, was a friend of Aleister. He was a friend of a lot of people, but he was a friend of Aleister Crowley and a member of British intelligence. Much like his cousin Christopher Lee, he was a member of the the Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare, basically the Nazi hunters, that were charged by Winston Churchill with setting Europe ablaze. But he knew that at least some of the German high command seemed to have a belief in astrology, and he proposed to British intelligence that they hire Aleister Crowley to tell them what the German astrologers were telling high command. British intelligence didn't go for this idea. But it came up again when Hess crashed. Accidentally, because again, has got this bright idea. Again, also very heavily driven by his own occult beliefs, because the British people were very much seen by Hess and some of the other Nazi party members as Aryans as well.
Mm.
So they thought there was this great spiritual kinship between the two people, and an alliance was only obvious. So Hess got into a plane, flew himself to England, and crashed in Scotland in an attempt to make a peace treaty between Great Britain and Nazi Germany without ever consulting with Adolf Hitler or anyone else to get permission to make such a peace treaty.
Yeah, he got himself expelled from the party for doing it.
Which is a moot point because he was very quickly captured
Yeah,
by British intelligence.
yeah. Spent the rest of his life in Spandau.
Yep. And funny enough, though, yet again, Ian Fleming and his bright ideas wanted to hire Aleister Crowley to help interrogate Hess. And the British government also said no to that. So, and there's other, like I said, there are rumors that Crowley was a spy. There are rumors that he was in cahoots with the Nazis and in communication with Adolf Hitler. There's no evidence whatsoever for those claims.
Right.
Even Crowley's biographers and his friends say, no, he never even tried to reach Hitler. This is a myth. It never happened. But he does come into the story a little, along with the always amusing fact that Aleister Crowley, the man so bad that Benito Mussolini kicked his ass out of Italy, which was why he was living in England at the time, is because the Italians didn't want him. Speaking of which, as a coming attraction, we've talked about this, and we pretty much this week and the next 2 weeks after it are going to be, we're going to finally make good on some promises. So this week, we've talked about Nazi occultism. Next week, we'll be talking about another topic I've promised you guys for years, which is John Dee, the magician, astrologer, and alchemist to Queen Elizabeth I. And then the week after that, and it's only going to be 2 weeks away because I think it makes more sense to talk about Dee first, we're going to finally talk about Aleister Crowley. And boys and girls, whether you believe in the occult or not, join us for the story of Aleister Crowley and buckle your seatbelts. He's an absolutely fascinating and extremely colorful character, whether you think he was a drug-addled idiot or a master of the black arts. Just the amount of... Because the reality is he had a huge influence on popular culture. For example, if anyone out there is a fan of the Kama Sutra and the whole tantric sex thing, thank Crowley. He's the one who introduced it to the West.
Mm.
But the last thing specifically about Nazi occultism I want to get into, because this is something I found quite recently. Yes, fruitcake definitely comes to mind, Selka. But there's a piece of pop culture / folklore I've been hearing for decades now. And I've been trying to run down the origin of that nobody seems to know, and I think I might have found it. I may be wrong, so don't take this as gospel, but it fits. Which is, why is it such a big deal in popular culture today for vampires and werewolves to fight each other? I've been told, oh, that's just part of folklore. It really isn't.
No.
In fact, as Brian and I both know, in Greek folklore, when a werewolf dies, they become a vampire.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that, as we've talked about many times, in folklore, there isn't this is a vampire, that's a werewolf, hard line between the two. But we do know that a couple of cultures had this concept of heroic werewolves that fought witches and devils for God and brought grain and stuff back from hell on certain days of the year. And ever since I heard of those gods' wolves, I thought that was the origin of the idea of the two sides fighting each other. Then I found this. That idea of heroic werewolves was very popular in Germany, particularly starting in the 19th century. You see a lot of 19th and early 20th century German horror writers writing stories about werewolves who are protectors of the land and protectors of the German people. The Nazis loved werewolf imagery. Hitler was a big fan of werewolf imagery.
Yeah.
Particularly towards the end of the war, they created these guerrilla units that are known as the werewolf units. So the obvious question becomes, they had this fascination with werewolves. What about vampires? The Germans did use vampires in their propaganda. They didn't use them in a positive light, though. They were parasites. They were these horrible, monstrous creatures that fed on German people, sapping their strength. And who were the vampires associated with? The Poles, the Slavs, and the Jews. You have these werewolf units, heroic, noble, fighting what was already at this point seen as a losing cause, particularly hunting down and killing ethnic, what the Germans saw as ethnic traitors, these Poles, these Slavs, and these Jews, and killing them. You have German propaganda depicting these inferior people as being vampires, as being parasites, like bloodsuckers.
Mm.
I could be wrong. I have not seen some folklorist or historian make this claim, but I'm seriously starting to think this might be where this idea comes from, or at least this might be what pushed this idea to be so popular. And there is more. There's even more there the deeper you go into it, because the Nazis used a lot of horror writers for their propaganda mills, and even some of the fiction, vampire fictions. Like, look at the movie Nosferatu. It's from before the Nazi takeover. It's from the 1920s. But the vampire has a hooked nose, has long fingers and fingernails. He's small and bald.
Very stereotypical look to him.
Yes. In some ways, a very stereotypical Jewish look to him, even more exaggerated.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of arguments that can be made there, but and certainly people who knew F.W. Monroe, the man who directed Nosferatu, did not think he was an anti-Semite. But there certainly are images there that are reminiscent of caricatures of Jews that were popular at the time. That again continues this whole idea of associating Judaism with vampirism and parasitism, which is also very much in keeping with Nazi ideas about the Jews and all the ridiculous. We could do a whole other show just on the ridiculous propaganda, like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Jewish blood libel myth, which is disgusting, all of which the Nazis used to their advantage. But I could be, again, for other people, because I know, Brian, you felt very uncomfortable when I pointed this out. I don't feel very comfortable about this revelation either. Don't quote me as gospel on this. I may be wrong, but it adds up in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
That this is where the two fight each other came from. Or at least where it became popularized. Because all the other things I could think of that really brought it to the public eye, like there's the scene of Dracula fighting the Wolfman in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is much later, which is after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
There is, of course, the Vampire the Masquerade role-playing game, which is much, much later than World War II. The Underworld movies and all these other things that really started this idea. But so to date, the farthest I've traced it back is pre-war and during war propaganda, again, about the Jews and about the Nazis. For those of you listening, I know Silka666 commented, the Animal Kingdom in the animal kingdom, excuse me, different carnivorous animals eat different prey, so they don't have to fight for it. But as there's enough humans for vampires and werewolves to prey upon without fighting, why they fight, they don't know. Which is an interesting question. And again, like I said, this seems to fit, and it does. Again, there was a big movement in the Germans in the time period making werewolves more heroic, even making witches more heroic as folk heroes than these ravening beast monsters. No, that's quite all right. Teresa Holgovsity Pagan commented, she's quiet when she's learning and fascinated. Thank you. That's a huge compliment. This is a really interesting topic, folks. Worth far more than one episode on it, but we've come up on the end of the hour, and to keep going, there's a lot more research to do. And the reality is, if you want to research the subject, there are some good sources out there. There is an excellent book called The Occult Roots of Nazism by Goodwin Clark. And it's a very well-researched, highly respected book that talks about aristocracy and the Thule Society and the other groups that probably influenced Nazi thinking before the war, but it kind of stops with the war. And then there's this other book that's much more recent called Hitler's Monsters, which also talks about before the war, but it also goes into during the war, and it's well sourced. And I did some research on it because, again, there's a lot of nonsense here as well, but it's generally well regarded among historians. And in the case with both of them, which is a huge difference, is a lot of the books you'll find on the subject. Are written by occultists of one stripe or another. They're people that believe in these supernatural forces influencing the world. And neither of the authors, as far as I can tell, neither Eric Kurlander, who's the guy who wrote Hitler's Monsters, nor Goodwin Clark, who wrote The Occult Roots of the Third Reich, are occultists. If you read their books, they're generally very dismissive of these ideas. They find them ridiculous. They're just doing their best to factually report on the information that's available, which I think makes them a better source than, say, Ravenscroft, who talked to mediums to get the information for his book, and a lot of the other sources that went to all these, who believed in magical powers, who believed in secret societies that controlled the world. And actually, this is something else I want to touch on real quick, because I think this is really important when discussing this, or any other any discussion of, was Hitler demonically possessed? And the answer is yes. I think Hitler was demonically possessed, but I think he was demonically possessed pretty late in the game and had very little to do with why he did what he did. I think it may be why he gets increasingly erratic towards the end of the war. That also may be explained by the fact he was suffering from Parkinson's and possibly syphilis. But Hitler did not, in my thesis on the subject, Hitler did not do terrible things because he was possessed. He was possessed because he did terrible things. It was a punishment for his crimes, not an excuse for them. But the thing I want people to realize about this, and this is true of Hitler, and this is true of Himmler, and Speer, and all of these other traitors to the human race, to be as blunt as I can be, is these were people. These were not giggling supervillains. These were not cartoonish characters of evil. They were not Satan with horns and tail. They were human beings. Hitler was not a complete monster. Germany was in an severe economic depression. He helped get it out of that. He absolutely loved, adored, and doted on his dogs. The Nazis passed some of history's first anti-smoking laws. They passed some of history's first animal protection laws. And the reason I say these things, and this is also critical, is I am not saying that Hitler was deep down a good guy. He wasn't. He was a monster. But he was a human monster. It is an extremely dangerous, if eminently understandable tendency to demonize evil people, to suggest there was some paranormal influence that made them as monstrous as they were. But when you make that mistake, you're more likely to ignore it next time. Don't, when you look, and I'm not getting in, we are not getting into modern politics. Not going there. But when you're looking at political figures you see as evil, whether you're a Democrat who sees Trump as evil, whether you're a Republican who sees Biden and Hillary as evil, whoever it is, and this is true either way, you need to remember even the worst people in history are still people with human motivations. Not everything they do is monstrous. Not everything they do is, everyone is both good and bad. Not, evil people do good things sometimes. Good people do evil things sometimes. If you think of evil people as entirely evil, and these giggling supervillains that you can smile and go, see, he's a monster, you're going to get tricked. Because don't just look at Hitler. Look at any serial killer. Look at when they talk to that serial killer's family, neighbors, loved ones, wives in some cases. He was such a nice, quiet boy. I never thought he could do that. I mean, there's at least one serial killer who, when he confessed to the cops laughed it off and ignored it. They were positive he was joking because he was a friend of theirs. Guy committed horrible acts, but he was he seemed like such a nice, normal guy. The cops couldn't believe it. And it's true. I mean, when you look at the Nazis, you find a lot of that true. There are things Hitler did that are absolutely monstrous. There's nothing monstrous about how he treated his dog Blondie. He loved that. He doted on that dog. There's some monstrous things when you think about how he doted on that dog and saw nothing wrong with sending millions of people to their deaths. Or if you want another real good example of my point, Heinrich Himmler. The SS ran the concentration camps. Well, he didn't. What was Martin Bormann that actually planned out the final solution?
That was Reinhard Heydrich.
I'm sorry. Well, it was Heydrich working under Himmler who planned the final solution. It was Himmler who organized and carried it out. Mm-hmm. When he went to a concentration camp and saw them just shooting down prisoners, he got spotted with the brains of one of the prisoners being shot. He not only threw up, he was horrified. He was disgusted by what was going on. So you know what he did? That was one of the main impetuses for the creation of the gas chambers. It was cleaner, it was less messy, and it didn't waste bullets. And then he went the hell home and he let his underlings carry it out. Mm-hmm. He was disgusted by what was being done too. He did it anyway. People ask all the time, how could people... And this is another thing to keep in mind. People ask all the time, how could people allow all of this to happen? And it's easier than anyone wants to think. They've done studies where if you hook somebody up to a chair that supposedly will give them electrical shocks and give another person a control where they can control the intensity of the shocks, they will keep shocking that person past the point they're told will kill them just because somebody they see in authority told them to do it. That's a big part of it. Is this we have this mindset to just follow. This is the person in charge. This is the person in authority. This is the person we've elected. We've got to go with what they told us to. They're right, my country right or wrong, my president right or wrong. That's the kind of mindset that leads to monsters, not giggling supervillains performing black magic rituals in the dark. So everything we've said, keep that, for God's sakes, keep that in mind, because we don't need another Hitler. That's actually another good example. Silke brought up the Nazi Party made a law in France. It's called the Good Citizen Law. If someone is in need of help, by law, you have to help them. And for that matter, law still stands today. People are people. Even, and for that matter, let me tell you, boys and girls, as somebody who's met and worked and talked to black magicians and people who really literally worship the devil. I'm not talking about Satanists. I'm not talking about people who follow the Church of Anton LaVey or the Satanic Temple. I'm talking about the actual deal. The people who actually, if you ask them, no, I worship Satan. They can be evil. They can be extremely ruthless. But most of them act like pretty normal people. They don't spend every waking hour thinking of sacrificing black cats to Satan. They go to work. They have whole jobs. They act like the rest. Evil people act like the rest of us 90% of the time. Anything you want to add on that, Brian?
No, I think you covered it pretty nicely. It's a good place to end.
Actually, the one thing I wanted to do before we end is very briefly open the floor in case any of our listeners had questions.
Oh, okay.
And then we'll end. And we're going to end soon because I keep thinking of more things I could bring up. Case in point, and I'm going to get into this real quick while we wait to see if anybody has questions. The whole idea of Satan worship, and as it relates to Nazi Germany, they weren't Satanists in the conventional sense. They didn't worship. There's no evidence I'm aware of that any of the Nazi Party worshipped the devil as the incarnation of evil. On the other hand, there is a movement in 19th and early 20th century German occultism that some of them seem to have sympathy for, called Luciferianism. Luciferianism repaints the image of the devil into not as, it's good to worship evil, but as this heroic figure rebel against a tyrannical god. And I'm not saying any of them worshipped him that way either, but some of them seem to have at least some sympathy for that image of Satan, of Lucifer.
Yeah, the rebel kind of idea.
It's a comment I just made on a Quora question the other day, where somebody about do evil people, does Satan or does any evil person think they're evil? No. If you ask Satan, he is the noble rebel fighting against a tyrannical God who wants to deny you free will. It's all in perspective. But I don't think we have any questions because we've given a good length of time. Nobody in the chat's asked anything, although Teresa Hall offered that chatty tonight, which I think is true. But I think it's probably Silke does say that they have no questions, but they did want to say thank you. Silke, thank you so much and Teresa and Serenity and anyone else who's been listening tonight or listens in the future. Thank you. Anyway, I should go into more detail about actual devil worship and Satanism. That's actually probably a good lead-in after we do the episode in Crowley, because Crowley definitely ties into Satanism, actual devil worship, I should say, not Satan, in some interesting ways. And it'll be a logical progression to go from Dee to Crowley to devil worship. So look for that episode in about 3 weeks, Teresa. But I think that's going to do it for tonight. Again, everybody in chat, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you guys hanging out. Everyone who's listening who isn't in chat or who listens later, thank you so much. We appreciate all of our listeners. Feel free, if you enjoyed what we're doing, to give us a like, give us a subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think of tonight's episode. Do you think that that Hitler was big into the occult, or do you think I'm right that we're right in saying that he just saw it as a propaganda tool? Do you think it was possessed by Satan or maybe by Cthulhu? Let us know in the comments. Also, if you like what we're doing, aside from commenting, sharing, and subscribing, please consider donating a little money if you can. Our Patreon and my PayPal email are both in the description below, as is my main personal email if you have any questions or comments or know a good guest you'd like me to get in touch with. That'll do it for tonight. Remember, next week we'll be talking about Dr. John D. Brian, you have anything you want to
add? Nope.
I'll add something on Brian's behalf because he didn't think of it. You might also consider going over to Amazon and looking up the name Brian McKinley and buying a couple of his books. They're really good. And I'm sure Brian would appreciate the money.
That would be nice.
But that's going to do it for tonight, everyone. I wanted to say good night and God bless. Brian?
Keep your fangs sharp.
Good night, everybody. Okay, we're off air.